I want to begin by commending Seth and initially and now Seth and Josh for the terrific work they've done on this topic. I think there's no question they've deepened and enriched our understanding of the Constitution's various officer and office-related clauses. At the end of the day, I'm not persuaded by some of their key arguments, and I'll try to briefly explain why, at least with respect to some of them. But there's no doubt in my mind that they've put forward a detailed, interesting, and plausible account of many of the clauses, which is worth taking seriously and working through patiently and responding to. So I really congratulate and commend them for that. Let me also at the outset make one comment that cuts in their favor. There's a question, an open question that we all face, which is how what our assumption is about how precise and careful the drafting of the Constitution was. We all bump into this question when we're exploring different clauses, and we can go in a couple different directions. We can assume a certain amount of sloppiness, inadvertence, rushed quality to the drafting, or we can assume quite a lot of care and precision. And I'm actually with them on the side of care and precision, and I'll mention one bit of evidence in that direction which they don't discuss, but which is, I think, quite striking. In 1828, Timothy Pickering sends a letter to John Marshall telling Marshall that way back when James Wilson told Pickering that at the very end of the convention, the Constitution was committed to him, and he went over it very carefully and very precisely to make sure everything was just right. Pickering sends a similar letter to another correspondent at the same time, and we have evidence from Ezra Stiles' diary that Abraham Baldwin, coming out of the convention, tells Stiles that Wilson took the very last pass on the Constitution, at least with Morris. That's a substantial amount of evidence that arguably the best lawyer at the convention, maybe in the entire country, went over the final draft of the Constitution very, very carefully. And I think we should take that into account when we think about this question of just how precise or careless and sloppy the provisions of the Constitution are. In the same vein, it is often said, we've all heard this notion that at the end of the convention, the delegates were absolutely worn out, they were tired, they were exhausted, they wanted to go home, so they were happy to just rush and finish. The important point to acknowledge in that context, however, is that Wilson was already at home. The Philadelphians, the Pennsylvanians were already at home. They spent the entire summer sleeping in their own beds, surrounded by their own libraries, able to draw on the kinds of sources that Seth is referring to. And I think that's also very important. They weren't boarded up in boarding houses in uncomfortable quarters. They had the best circumstances possible in which to do the kind of lawyering and the kind of drafting of the document that he is referring to. And I agree with him that we ought to, at least in the first instance and maybe in the second and the third, try to make sense and reconcile all of these different provisions in the Constitution as best we can, so there are no contradictions, so it all really does make sense. I think we should do that up to a point, because I'm willing to also acknowledge that there may be some oversights, some accidents, some sloppiness. That's also a possibility, but I do tend to incline toward them with that primary provisional assumption. So with all that in mind, let me turn to some of the main claims that they make in their paper, and I can only talk out of a few of them here. Obviously, I'm going to focus on pages 28 to 37 of their paper, and here are 8 claims that they make that I think are quite important. First, the Constitution's officers of the United States language is defined by the Appointments Clause. The Blunt trial reaffirms that elected officials are not officers of the United States. Officers of the United States must be created through statutes by law. Officers of the United States can only be appointed, not elected. The phrase officer in the government of the United States in the Necessary and Proper Clause refers to a different category of positions than does officers of the United States. That's a confusing part of their paper to me, but let me try to unpack at least 3 claims that I think are made as corollaries. First, the Necessary and Proper Clause does not, in fact, refer to officers of the United States. They have a different locution that they think is at issue. Second, the president is not one of the officers of the government of the United States or officers of the United States to which the necessary and proper clause refers. And third, the Secretary of State is one of the officers to which the necessary and proper clause refers. So those are 8 claims that they make. I think all of them are mistaken, or at least highly questionable as a matter of original understanding and original meaning. And I'll try to very briefly explain why. Let's begin with the necessary and proper clause. Notably, it's missing from the Venn diagram that they present for us on page 28.
Over your shoulder.
Okay.
I knew he was going there.
Is it on this one? No. Okay. So it's missing from their Venn diagram. Any theory of the Constitution's officer language must come to grips with the necessary and proper clause, which in the eyes of many commentators, such as Gary Lawson, William Van Alstyne, and others, is plausibly considered the single most important clause in the entire Constitution. When Steve Calabresi first encountered Tillman's early work on the Constitution's officer language, he pointed out that Tillman's theory was incompatible with the necessary and proper clause. I had the similar reaction when I first encountered his work. And I think the problem persists. The problem in a nutshell is that the necessary and proper clause refers on its face to a class of officers we might call constitutional officers, not appointed officers. The critical language of the clause, which Tillman and Blackmun pass over in silence, is all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. The officers to which the necessary and proper clause refers are officers in which powers are vested by the Constitution, not by statute. The Secretary of State does not fit the bill, nor for that matter does any appointed officer of the United States. The President of the United States, however, is an officer of the United States, I believe, in whom powers are vested by the Constitution. The necessary and proper clause authorizes Congress to pass necessary and proper laws to carry into execution the powers vested by the Constitution and the President of the United States. That perfectly straightforward paraphrase is how the clause has, in part, almost always been understood since the founding, and it is the constitutional basis of countless federal laws and statutory provisions. The fact that Tillman and Blackmun cannot comfortably affirm this simple proposition and that they deny that the president is one of the officers to which the necessary and proper clause refers is, I believe, a major weakness and vulnerability of their theory, and at least I would like to hear more from them on that point. There are other problems with the account of the necessary and proper clause that they provide. In the interest of time, let me move on to 2 other clauses, the appointments clause and the impeachment clause, the Blunt affair. I'll try to compress this. Tillman and Blackmun believe there are 2 possible categories of officers we might think of in the Constitution: constitutional officers, to which I referred, whose offices are established by the Constitution itself, and whose mode of appointment is provided for by the other provisions of the Constitution outside of Article 2. And secondly, statutory officers, whose offices will be established by law and whose mode of appointment is provided for in Article 2. Tillman and Blackmun believe that the first category does not exist. On their view, all officers of the United States hold offices created by statute, they're appointed, not elected officials, and they're appointed in one of the 3 ways outlined in Article 2. And they summarize this point by describing their view as one in which the phrase, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, is in a positive. It's definitional of officers of the United States. So let's call the 2 alternatives I've identified as the appositive and non-appositive readings of the not herein otherwise provided language of the appointments clause, because the other possibility is that that refers, in fact, to appointments that are specified outside of Article 2. My point is that the drafting history of this clause does not support the appositive reading that they provide, but actually supports the non-appositive reading. So let me run through some examples for you. If we try to trace the origin of this language of the Constitution, the Committee of the Whole on June 13th resolved that the national executive should, quote, to appoint to offices in cases not otherwise provided for. The New Jersey plan had similar language, that the executive, besides their general authority to execute the federal acts, ought to appoint all federal officers not otherwise provided for. The resolutions of the Committee of Detail, that were referred to the Committee of Detail, to appoint to offices in cases not otherwise provided for. Randolph's draft for the Committee of Detail, to appoint to offices not otherwise provided for by the Constitution, and so on and so forth. In Wilson's drafts, in the Committee of Detail draft, in the proceedings referred to the Committee of Style. I suggest if you go back and look at all of those drafting clauses, the positive reading of that particular language that Tillman and Blackmun are advancing cannot be sustained. I had to compress that, but let me move on quickly in the interests of time. What then are the, well, here, let me try to get this right. So the drafting history doesn't support it. The other point to make here is that the framers did not always draw a sharp distinction between appointed and elected officials in the manner presupposed by Tillman and Blackmun. On the contrary, they used the term appointment in both broad and narrow ways. And in its broad usage, appointment referred in a general way to the mode by which officials were selected, one of which was by election. And the way we can see this is to trace the evolution of the discussion of how the president would be selected in the course of the convention. And very often that was described as appointment. The president would be selected in a manner that could be characterized as an appointment. So let me just briefly describe some of that evidence. June 2nd, Mr. Wilson proposed that the United States should be divided into districts, each of which should elect a certain number of persons who should have the appointment of the executive. June 2nd, Mr. Gary observed that if the appointment of the executive should be made by the national legislature, it would be done in such a way as to prevent intrigue. Same day, Mr. Williamson observed that if the electors were to choose the executive, it would be attended with considerable expense and trouble, whereas the appointment made by the legislature would be easy and, in his opinion, the least liable to objection. This continues throughout the entire summer on June 7th, June 8th, July 19th, July 10th, skipping a date backwards, July 19th, July 23rd, and that's where I stopped. Each of those instances are ones in which the delegates are talking about the appointment of the executive. And of course, the mode of appointment of the executive doesn't make its way into the Constitution till the very end of the process, the Committee on Postponed Parts. I believe that's the primary or the principal appointment to which the Appointments Clause is referring to when it talks about not herein otherwise provided for. It's pointing back to that appointment of the president. In fact, I'd have to elaborate on this claim, obviously, quite a bit more, but let me mention that there are also other forms of appointment in the Constitution that we shouldn't forget. So, for example, Article 1, Section 3 describes a method of temporary appointments made by state governors to fulfill vacancies in the Senate. I think there are other appointments as well outside of the Appointments Clause. Okay. Let me just stop. I didn't really get to the blunt impeachment, but I'll just quickly make my principal point there. Tillman and Blackmun contend that the blunt impeachment trial reaffirms that elective officials are not officers of the United States. On originalist grounds, this seems to be one of the weakest parts of their paper. The leading student of the blunt impeachment, Buckner F. Melton Jr., has argued emphatically and persuasively that the Senate never held or suggested that senators are not impeachable. There's a mountain of evidence to suggest that that's the case, including all of those members of the House who voted for the blunt impeachment. I had a research assistant look this up. 2 were framers, Dayton and Baldwin. 23 others were members of the state ratifying conventions. We are led to believe that all of those men voted in favor of impeaching Blunt, knowing that the Constitution prohibited doing so. I don't think that makes sense. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Pop quiz, you did the reading. So 3 questions, okay? Question number 1. Are members of Congress subject to the Foreign Emoluments Clause? This clause applies to those who hold office of profit or trust under them, and this context of them refers back to the United States. You have to raise your hands, but Do you think members of Congress hold an office under the United States? Answer yes or no. You don't need to raise your hands. Okay, that's question number one. Question number two, incompatibility clause. If members of Congress hold office under the United States, do senators and representatives violate the incompatibility clause? That is, if a member of Congress has an office under the United States for one clause, then in this clause they can't be members of Congress. Now, how many of you ever noticed this? I say none of you, because I hadn't. The only person I think on planet Earth who ever noticed this was Seth Barrett Tillman.
It's not true. People before.
Mostly exaggerating. Seth sees things that we do not, and he has the goods to back them up. So, for example, turn to page 36, and we have 3 quotes of people who said that the president is not an officer in the government. Edwin Bates, David McKnight, and a senator from the 1870s. We didn't make this up. Everything we say here was known but was lost to memory. India is lost. We've lost India. We've lost this lexicon. So again, do you think members are subject to the Foreign Emoluments Clause? If so, they can't be senators. So now you may say, wait a minute, Joshua, okay, fine. Senators and representatives are not office under the United States, but the president is. How do you draw that line? How do you draw the line? And I'll tell you, it's not just between elected and appointed. At the very end of the paper, we have a discussion on what's called public trust. And there are different ways to define the apex officials. One is elected appointed, but another one is subject to supervision. This is an important point. The president is not subject to supervision. No one tells him how to use a veto. Members of Congress are not subject to supervision. No one tells them how to vote. The Secretary of State, yeah, you can tell them what to do. The Clerk of the House, yeah, you can tell them what to do. Federal judges, different ball of wax. But at least the appointed positions in the executive branch and the appointed positions in the legislative branch are non-apex officials. What we've shown here, and let me go back to our first Venn diagram, is that there is a logic to the Constitution that's been lost. There's a history that we've abandoned. And people just assumed that the president has to be in office of the United States. They've assumed. And to make these assumptions work, they draw epicycles. Well, maybe the president should commission himself, right? Maybe members of Congress should get commissions, right? Maybe the line is what Akil Mar said between legislative and office and executive, right? You draw these epicycles that don't hold up. Now, at the very beginning of our paper, we said our burden is small. We're not here to persuade you. That was never our goal. If we have, mazel tov, we've done it, right? Got some Yiddish. We persuaded you. Our goal is far more modest, to simply show that the other theories don't work. Now, maybe, I think John put forward a number of arguments, which we can address in the Q&A, but we'll ask John, what's your theory? Right? What is your theory? Do you accept the Blumenthal maximalist view? Do you accept the Akil Mar view? Or do you accept no view? Clause bound. Every clause is an entity to itself, right? We just go, every clause means what's on by itself. The framers were sloppy here, they were careful there. I don't find that view acceptable. Now, this is an issue that should be abstract, but is not because of President Trump, of course. That's been the 800-pound blonde-haired gorilla in the back of the room, right? We haven't talked about him yet. Before 2016, Tillman labored in obscurity, and I don't say that lightly. No one cared about this issue. No one cared. In fact, Seth persuaded me years ago, long before I even heard of Donald Trump as president. He persuaded me. I thought, wow, this is a pretty good theory. But because our theory will allow President Trump to do things people don't like, there's been a stigma, right? There's been a stigma. We've been attacked from every corner. And I have to give Seth credit. He was unwavering, absolutely unwavering. To call Akil and Vikram Mar wrong, that takes some guts. To call Steve Calabrese and Prakash, people who I consider dear friends, wrong, that's not easy, right? To go up against prominent legal historians from the top universities in the country, we don't have PhDs in history. That takes guts, right? To take a position that DOJ even won't take, that takes some guts. And I give Seth all the credit. I've mostly been along for this ride. I'm having a blast. I'm very happy to be here. I'm grateful to John and Lawrence for moderating. And I see the queue is about to blow up, so I will stop talking. And I am here to listen to your questions. I probably can't answer all of them, but I'm very thankful. Thank you so much.